Good evening everyone, my name is Erica, I'm a tutor at Creating Kids, and welcome back to episode 7 of this video series. Sorry for the lack of video on Sunday. This cold and flu season has been a little bit ruthless, but we're mostly back in action now, so thanks very much for your patience. In this week's episode we're going to be talking about Booleans, so we'll be looking at what they are, and we'll be looking at a couple of Boolean blocks that you can find in Scratch. So first of all, what is a Boolean? A Boolean is a data type, although you don't need to know too much about what this word means at the moment. We will be covering in the next episode. What you do need to know is that a Boolean is a truth value. So it's essentially a statement that will either evaluate to be true or false. Or it will alternatively evaluate to 1 or 0, where 1 represents true and 0 represents false. It sort of just depends on the programming, like the conventions of your programming language. So in Scratch, Boolean blocks will have a very distinctive shape, so they'll have the triangular ends that make it sort of look like an elongated hexagon. I'll show you what they look like in just a moment. But first of all, an example of a Boolean statement might be the sum of 3 and 4 is 7. This is a Boolean statement because it evaluates to be true. The sum of 3 and 4 is indeed 7. Another example of a Boolean statement might be the sum of 3 and 4 is 10. This is still a Boolean statement because it evaluates to be false. We've established that the sum of 3 and 4 is indeed not 10, it's actually 7. So, Boolean data types are generally associated with control flow statements, which we looked at in last week's episode, but just to give you a quick refresher, control flow statements essentially sort of change the flow of execution of instructions from your program. So if your instructions are from top down instead of executing from the top to the bottom, a control flow statement might add in branching paths or something like that. So Booleans, back to the original point, Booleans tend to form the conditions under which control flow statements execute. So to give you a little bit of an idea of what I mean by that, I'll show you a couple of examples. So if I'll just turn the camera around here. So in Scratch, there are 4 control statements that whose conditions are formed by Booleans, and you'll see here this kind of elongated hexagonal cutout is where Boolean is meant to go. So the if x then block, the if x then else block, the wait until x block, and the repeat until x block are all control flow statements whose conditions are formed by Booleans. So just give me one moment here. You can only fill in the blank spots here with Boolean statements. So if I drag one of these out and I find a Boolean statement which has the triangular edges here, then they will fit very nicely into the niche there. But if you tried to use something with circular ends, for example, it doesn't actually work. So one other thing that I should mention is with these control flow statements that are controlled by Booleans, when you have a statement in here, it has to evaluate to true before the instructions in here are executed. So if you have something like this, for example, then if this statement evaluates to be true, then this instruction here will be executed, but if it's false, then nothing will actually happen. Anyway, I'll come back to that in just a moment, but first of all, let's go back to the original point. There are 2 different kinds of Boolean blocks that you can find in Scratch. The first type are Boolean blocks that check for specific conditions, and you can find these in the sensing category in Scratch, which is up here. So an example of a Boolean block of this category might be the touching color X Boolean. So essentially what this does is it checks to see if the sprite is touching the color that is depicted here in this box here, and if the sprite is touching this color, then it will evaluate to be true, otherwise it will evaluate to be false. So let's have a look at a program that uses a Boolean from this type of category. If I could just direct your attention here. So essentially what this program does is, I don't know if you can see it, but when the flag button is clicked, which we will do, essentially the program, sorry, let me just disable these other ones here. Essentially what will happen is when you click the flag button up here, the program will wait until the space key is pressed, and when this condition becomes true, so when somebody presses the space key, then Scratch Cat will say hello for 2 seconds. Now the other kind of Boolean block that you can find in Scratch are Boolean blocks that compare values, and you can find these in the operators category here in Scratch. So an example of a block of this type of category might be this one here. So essentially what it does is it looks at the two values that are input, which will be numbers, and it will see if they are equal or not. So if they are equal, then it will evaluate to be true. If they aren't, it will evaluate to be false. So for example, if you had 1 in both of these blocks, then this will evaluate to true, because 1 does indeed equal 1. But if you had 5 in here, for example, then that statement would evaluate to be false, because 5 does not equal 1. And if you click on it as well, it actually comes up with a pop-up that will say false, although this doesn't come up on the camera quite so nicely. So an example of a program using this type of Boolean is this one just here. So essentially, let's get rid of this. Essentially what happens here is when the flag button is clicked, so when your program is started, the program will pick 2 random numbers between 1 and 10. If the first of these numbers is smaller than the second of these numbers, then this statement will evaluate to be true and the condition here will be executed. But if the first number is equal to or larger than the second number, then this statement will be evaluated to be false and nothing will happen. So Scratchcat won't say anything at all. A workaround around this particular block is the if-else block, which is quite interesting. Here, if you use the if-else block, if this statement evaluates to be true, then the first instruction will be executed, so Scratchcat will say hello. Otherwise, if it evaluates to be false, then it will execute the condition here under else, so Scratchcat will say goodbye instead. So just to, let me turn that around, to recap everything that we've learned in this video, Booleans are truth values, so there we go. So Booleans are truth values, so there are statements that either evaluate to true or false, or 1 or 0, depending on the conventions of your programming language, where 1 represents true and 0 represents false. Booleans have a very specific shape in Scratch to help you tell the difference between it and other blocks. It will have the triangular ends, sort of an elongated horizontal shape. So Boolean data types are generally used to form conditions to control flow statements, which we talked about in last week's episode. There are 2 different types of Boolean statements in Scratch. You have Boolean blocks that check for very specific conditions, and you can find these types of blocks in the sensing category, or you have Boolean blocks that compare values, and you can find these in the operators category. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Just wanted to draw your attention to something if you're not aware already. We're turning this video series into a blog series as well. So if you've missed earlier episodes or you've just found them super confusing and really hard to understand, then make sure to check out our blog posts instead or as well. Everything's written out for you. There's nice pictures to go along with it. It's nice. So I'll leave links to the first and second blog posts down in the description for you to check out. And join us again on Thursday for our next video on data types. So see you then.